Hello, everybody. This is Mr. Laubach. In this video, we are going to go over the Carter administration. Now, Jimmy Carter, of course, was a Democrat. He was from Georgia, and during his campaign, he portrayed himself as an outsider to Washington, and that really resonated. And in the 1976 election, he was able to defeat incumbent Gerald Ford. Now, while Carter's outside status had helped him win the presidency, it really hurt him as he attempted to govern. Even some congressional Democrats resented the president's criticism of traditional Washington politics. Carter was a devout evangelical Christian who claimed to have been born again. Carter attempted to bring a more informal style to the presidency. He sometimes made television public addresses wearing a sweater, not the standard suit, and he famously carried his own suitcase when traveling. He also made an effort to appoint more women and minorities to positions in his staff. Like Nixon and Ford, Carter wrestled unsuccessfully with a bad economy. Stagflation continued, meaning high unemployment and high inflation. Carter also attempted to curb inflation by cutting government spending, a policy that alienated many liberal Democrats. The president encouraged the Federal Reserve Board, the Fed, to combat inflation by restricting the money supply. This produced high interest rates and it depressed the economy without fully reining in inflation. When Carter left office, inflation was still high at 12% and unemployment stood at 8%. Adding to America's economic woes of the 1970s was the OPEC cartel of mostly Middle Eastern oil-producing nations that drove up the price of crude oil. This resulted in much higher prices for gas and other petroleum products, helping to fuel inflation. President Carter made energy a priority of his administration, and he pushed for the establishment of the Department of Energy in 1977. Congress passed the National Energy Act of 1978, which deregulated the oil and gasoline markets and encouraged energy conservation. Carter encouraged deregulation in other industries as a way of stimulating the economy. During his presidency, the airline and brewing industries were deregulated. His successor, Ronald Reagan, would carry this program of economic deregulation further in the 1980s. President Carter made the promotion of human rights the centerpiece of his foreign policy. This idealistic approach marked a distinct contrast to the Nixon and Kissinger era. Carter decided to sign a treaty with Panama, which would return the Canal Zone to the Panamanian sovereignty in 1999, which of course happened. Critics like Reagan decried this treaty as a sacrifice of American interests. In 1979, building on diplomacy begun during the Ford administration, Carter signed a SALT II agreement with the Soviets that placed further limitations on nuclear arsenals of the two superpowers, hoping to continue détente. This treaty was never ratified by the U.S. Senate, so it did not happen. In December of that year, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. Alarmed by this aggression and what seemed like a Soviet drive towards the oil-rich Middle East, Carter canceled participation in the 1980 Moscow Summer Olympics. The period of détente with the Soviet Union was over. President Carter's greatest diplomatic achievement was his mediation of talks between Israel and Egypt that resulted in the Camp David Accords. This agreement provided the foundation for a long-standing peace between these two countries. In 1979, a revolution overthrew the Shah of Iran and forced him to leave the country. The revolutionary government was increasingly dominated by fundamentalist Muslim clerics. One of those, the Ayatollah Khomeini, became the ruling force in Iran. In October of 1979, Carter allowed the ailing Shah into the United States to receive treatments for cancer. What Carter saw as a humanitarian gesture infuriated the Khomeini regime in Iran. On November 4th, protesters instigated by the government overran the American embassy in Tehran, Iran. The 66 Americans working there were taken hostage. The Iranians held the hostages for 444 days. After the initial assaults on the embassy, President Carter cut off American trade with Iran and froze Iranian assets in the United States. The Carter administration appeared ineffective and weak because it could not secure the freedom of the American hostages in Iran. The hostages were not released until January of 1981, shortly after the inauguration of Ronald Reagan as president. Now, the election of 1980, President Carter, looking for a second term, waged his campaign for re-election weighed down by an economy and the Iran hostage crisis. Despite this, he was able to turn back a challenge for the Democratic nomination by Senator Edward Kennedy the brother of JFK and Robert Kennedy, who were both very popular and, of course, the victims of assassinations. The veteran conservative champion Ronald Reagan easily captured the Republican nomination. Reagan hammered Carter's record and vowed to restore American military strength while at the same time cutting taxes. Reagan also promised to devolve power from the federal government back to the states. He openly appealed to traditional conservative values such as patriotism and support for the nuclear family, which seemed to be underappreciated in the post-Watergate years. Reagan's message resonated with many voters, and he won a decisive victory, both with the popular vote and the Electoral College. Some big takeaways. President Carter's outsider status hurt him, especially in terms of getting legislation passed in Congress, where you got to play the politics game. Carter demonstrated his political skills by helping Egypt and Israel bridge their differences through the Camp David Accords. However, he was unable to negotiate a release of American hostages in Iran, and this most likely cost him a second term. Ronald Reagan was elected as a conservative and restored the pride for many Americans. And the election of Ronald Reagan marked the end of Period 8 and the beginning of Period 9. All right, I hope this information helps you better understand the presidency of Jimmy Carter. Have a great rest of the day.